Welcome to her Fireside Stories channel, dear listeners. Tonight, prepare yourself for an unforgettable journey into family betrayal and justice served cold. Imagine coming home one morning only to discover the locks changed and your own daughter standing behind the door, claiming your house as hers. Evelyn's nightmare becomes a riveting battle for truth unfolding in dramatic courtroom showdowns and painful confrontations. But the most compelling moment is when Evelyn discovers the one crucial document that could change everything. The deed still has her name. How far would you go if someone you loved betrayed you this deeply? Make sure to listen to the entire story to witness how Evelyn regains her home and perhaps her dignity. If you love emotional stories that challenge family bonds and loyalty, please subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales like this one. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. Did Evelyn do the right thing? Where are you tuning in from tonight? Now let's dive into Evelyn's heart-stopping journey. I never imagined the day would come when I'd be standing outside my own home, hearing my daughter declare that I was no longer welcome. Those words rang out like a thunderclap in the quiet suburban neighborhood where I'd spent decades of my life. The sun hadn't even crested the rooftops that morning when I first realized something was off. My key refused to fit in the lock. At first, I thought maybe I'd grabbed the wrong set of keys. I had 3 look-alike copies that jangled in my purse. It was only after I tried every last key on the ring that panic settled into my gut like a cold stone. When I pressed the doorbell, I could already see that the window blinds were pulled shut, something that rarely happened unless the entire family was away on vacation. When the door finally swung open, I expected to see a stranger, maybe a contractor I had hired and forgotten about. Instead, my daughter Vanessa stood there, arms folded, lips set in a tight line. She wore casual clothes, a faded t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. It looked like she'd been living in that house for days, maybe longer. The shock pinned me to the spot, but the true dagger was when she uttered, "This is my house now." My immediate reaction was denial. I practically laughed in her face, thinking it was a prank, but her steely gaze and the unwavering tone told me it was all too real. She stepped out to meet me on the porch, not offering me so much as an inch to pass. I tried to keep my composure, but the adrenaline surged. How could my daughter do this? What right did she have? Still, I forced myself to speak calmly. "Vanessa, what's going on here? Where are all my things?" My heart hammered because I already sensed the answer. My daughter had decided that she belonged in my home, and I was an uninvited guest. I never believed that a morning as ordinary as this could spin my life into chaos. But there I was forced to reconcile the impossible. My own flesh and blood was locking me out of the place I'd called home for years. By the time I managed to regain a sliver of composure, my hands were trembling. I clutched my purse in a death grip as I demanded an explanation. Vanessa didn't falter. She simply looked me in the eyes and reiterated, "It's mine." There was no hesitation, no apology. It was as if she'd rehearsed this scene in her head 100 times, waiting for the moment I'd finally discover the changed locks. I glanced around the yard, remembering all those summer barbecues we'd shared as a family. Me, Vanessa, and her late father, Gerald. The two of them playing frisbee while I tended to the flowers. Even the front porch swing, the one Gerald and I used to sit on during warm evenings, swayed in the breeze, as if it too felt the betrayal that now tinted the air. I tried to reason with her to break through this bizarre bubble she'd constructed. "Vanessa, I don't understand. I paid off the mortgage years ago. This deed has my name on it, not yours. How could you possibly claim it's your house?" She merely shrugged and avoided my direct gaze, as though my words were inconsequential. She leaned against the doorframe, arms still crossed, and told me she'd taken care of all the paperwork. From the tone of her voice, it was clear she believed she had the upper hand. My disbelief morphed into anger. I wanted to storm inside and tear the entire place apart until I found the root of her scheme. but the thick metal deadbolt in Vanessa's defiance kept me firmly on the porch. What hurt the most was remembering the nights Vanessa spent in my arms as a crying toddler, or the teen years when I'd helped guide her through heartbreak and disappointment. The bond between mother and daughter was supposed to be unbreakable, or so I thought, yet here she was treating me like a trespasser. For a moment, I felt like a stranger staring at a reflection in cracked glass, trying to piece together the fractures. Had I done something to push her to this extreme? Or had she always been capable of something so callous, and I was just too blind to see it? My voice trembled as I pleaded, "Vanessa, we can talk about this. Let me in. I'm your mother." But I was met with a dismissive shake of her head. She tightened her grip on the door. Then, with chilling finality, she said, "You can't live here anymore. I've moved your things out. This place belongs to me now." It felt as though the ground gave way beneath my feet. I had nowhere else to go, nowhere else that felt like home. Everything I owned, every piece of me was tied to this house. My memories with Gerald, my photo albums, the crocheted blankets made by my mother and grandmother before me. I glanced behind Vanessa, noticing boxes stacked against the wall in the foyer. Could those be all my belongings? The idea that she'd tossed my life into cardboard boxes without my knowledge or consent made my stomach twist. Still, I was too stunned to respond. I tried to reach for the doorknob one last time, but Vanessa stepped inside and shut the door in my face. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot on that otherwise silent street. I stood there stunned for what felt like an eternity. My neighbors were likely preparing for their day, sipping coffee or hustling their children off to school, and here I was forcibly evicted by my own flesh and blood. It took several minutes for my shock to subside enough for me to think. I dialed my friend Clarissa, my voice quivering as I asked if I could stay with her just for the night. She immediately said yes, though neither of us knew that just for the night might turn into something far more complicated. With shaky steps, I walked away from my own front door, each footfall on the path, feeling like an irrevocable step away from everything I'd ever built. Little did I know that this morning's betrayal was just the first layer of a far deeper, far more dangerous rift between my daughter and me. Where are you reading this from, and how are you feeling about the story so far? Comment 1 if you like the tension building, or 2 if you think it needs a different twist. That evening, I found myself sitting on Clarissa's living room sofa, replaying the day's events in my mind like a broken record. She offered me a cup of chamomile tea, but the comforting warmth did little to ease the dread seizing my heart. Clarissa had known me since we were teenagers. She remembered the early days of my marriage and the joys we shared when Vanessa was born. "I just can't wrap my head around this," she said, placing her hand gently over mine. "You've always been close to Vanessa, at least from what I remember." My thoughts spiraled back to how I'd raised my daughter. As a widow, I poured every ounce of love and resource into ensuring Vanessa had a stable life. When she got her first job, it was me who co-signed her car loan. When she wanted to learn about property investments, I handed her the binder of documents that detailed everything about my home mortgage papers, tax records, and indeed, the deed itself. That was the moment I realized the full gravity of my oversight. I'd given Vanessa complete access to every important piece of paper connected to my house. The trust that once felt natural now loomed over me as a fatal mistake. Sure, I was naive to hand it all over without question, but never in my wildest dreams did I anticipate she'd use that information against me. It wasn't like Vanessa to act out. She'd always been somewhat headstrong like me in my younger years, but this was a staggering betrayal. Could she have forged something? Clarissa asked, voicing the question I'd been too frightened to say out loud. When I looked into my friend's eyes, I saw genuine concern and realized just how unprepared I was for the legal and emotional quagmire ahead. Even worse, I was terrified at the thought of discovering just how deep Vanessa's manipulations ran and whether she'd been planning this for weeks, months, or even years under my nose. After a sleepless night spent tossing and turning on Clarissa's pull-out couch, I decided I needed clarity, real tangible clarity. I resolved to piece together the chain of events that led to my exile. So, the next day, Clarissa and I cleared her small dining table and spread out every document I still had left in my purse or in the dusty metal box she kept in her attic for me. That box contained old receipts, a few utility bills, and some letters regarding minor renovations. It was hardly comprehensive, but it was something. We sifted through the paperwork with a sort of desperate hope, searching for any sign that might indicate the method Vanessa had used to claim ownership of my house. As we sorted, Clarissa remarked on the gaps. "It's strange how many critical documents are missing," she said, picking up a letter I'd received from the county assessor's office 2 years ago. I realized with a growing sense of horror that all the vital papers, my official mortgage discharge, notice the recent property tax statements, were no longer in my possession. The single thought pounding in my head was that I'd handed them over to Vanessa. Where else could they be? The question was whether she'd used them for some legal sleight of hand or if she'd forged signatures. My hands started to tremble just thinking about it. I tried to maintain calm, but it felt like navigating a labyrinth of betrayal. Vanessa had apparently been stealthy, gathering every puzzle piece she needed. For years, I'd seen her as the sweet child, the one who overcame her father's death and marched forward. Now I couldn't avoid the question. Had she always harbored resentment? Did she think I was holding on to the house out of spite, preventing her from starting her own adult life? Or was this simply greed, fueled by an illusion of entitlement? The answers eluded me, but the weight of my own naivety pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. The deeper I delved, the more I found that I'd given Vanessa not just access to documents, but also emotional leverage over me. I realized that in recent months, she'd grown more secretive, brushing off conversations with vague remarks like, "Don't worry, I'll handle it," whenever I inquired about utility bills or property taxes. I'd always assumed she was being helpful, eager to lighten my load in my retirement. Now, every memory of her offering to take care of things felt like a neon sign pointing straight to a setup. Still confusion intertwined with heartbreak. There had been no outward signs of malice, no arguments big enough to justify this coup, no dramatic fights over inheritance. My mind kept replaying all the times we'd bonded over coffee, over holiday dinners, over the grief we shared for Gerald's passing. Those memories clashed violently with the reality that she'd effectively stolen my home, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a stack of outdated papers. By dusk, Clarissa and I had concluded one thing: I needed legal counsel, and fast. Much as I wanted to believe this was some misunderstanding, I knew in my gut that Vanessa had crossed a line. "You can't just ignore this," Clarissa said, reading my hesitation. She was right. I'd tried to avoid confrontation, hoping my daughter would return to her senses if given time. But days were passing and I was still homeless. I could only imagine how Vanessa might be rearranging or discarding my belongings. Anger surged in me again, but it was tempered by an even heavier sorrow. This wasn't how a mother-daughter relationship was supposed to be. Do you think Evelyn was too trusting, or is Vanessa purely at fault here? Comment 1 if you blame Evelyn's naivety, or 2 if you think Vanessa's betrayal is inexcusable. That same night, the reality of my situation sank in deeper than ever. I'd run out of calm explanations or plausible excuses for Vanessa's behavior. As I lay on Clarissa's couch, I was startled by how cold the night felt. It was a biting chill that seeped into my bones, a physical reminder that I no longer had a place to call my own. The next morning, in a desperate attempt at distraction, I rummaged through an old folder I'd found tucked into the bottom of Clarissa's attic boxes. It was labeled in my own handwriting, though I couldn't recall the exact contents. When I flipped it open, my heart jolted. There, nestled between faded warranty receipts and flyers for roofing services, was a copy of my home's original deed. The date at the bottom was from decades ago, the day Gerald and I first closed on our mortgage. My name was there in bold letters. Evelyn Rochester Gerald's signature was right next to mine. Tears threatened as the old memories rushed back. The excitement of our first home, the sense of security it gave us. But that wave of nostalgia was followed by a new, sharper stab of resolve. If this original deed showed that I was still the official owner, or at least had been at the start, maybe the new paperwork Vanessa was flaunting had no legal standing after all. Even with that glimmer of hope, 1,000 fears fluttered in my mind. Could Vanessa have filed something that negated this old deed? What if she'd fabricated an entire chain of title transfers? I didn't know the legal complexities, but I did know that a notarized document is often required for transferring property. Without my signature, any attempt to claim the house would be invalid. At least that was the theory. My chest felt lighter at the possibility. This might be the evidence I needed to challenge Vanessa in a court of law if it came to that. I called Clarissa into the room, voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and dread. "Look at this," I said, holding up the deed. She peered over my shoulder, and I watched her face light up with recognition. "This could be the key," she whispered, the corners of her lips curving into a hopeful smile. It was the first time in days that we both felt the faint glow of optimism. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as I'd feared. Maybe I had just enough leverage to prove beyond any doubt that the house was still legally mine. Once the initial rush of relief subsided, practicality set in. I needed a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. But I also realized something else. My daughter must know. I still had this original deed tucked away somewhere. She would have combed through my personal files carefully. The fact that she hadn't found it meant either she overlooked it or assumed I'd lost it. That small oversight might be Vanessa's downfall. A disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if she'd changed the locks precisely to keep me away long enough to file additional documents behind my back? Either way, it was time to act. Sitting and crying about my predicament wouldn't change a thing. The house was mine, at least on paper, and now I had tangible proof. The next step would be to confront Vanessa or to visit an attorney, maybe both. I couldn't imagine facing her without some legal advice first. The daughter I loved was showing a side I barely recognized, and the only shield I could rely on now was the letter of the law. Deep in my heart, a swirl of conflicting emotions played out. Heartbreak, betrayal, anger, and yes, a thread of lingering love. Despite everything, I was her mother, and I couldn't simply shut off my maternal instincts. But if she continued down this path, I knew I had to protect myself legally, financially, and emotionally. The document in my hands felt like a lifeline, one that I gripped with all the silent determination I could muster. That night, I barely slept. But the reasons were different this time. Instead of being weighed down by hopelessness, I was buzzing with anxious energy, thinking of possible scenarios. What if Vanessa refused to back down? What if the courts sided with her? Clarissa, ever the practical one, reminded me that evidence was on my side. "She can't just take your house with a snap of her fingers," she reassured me. But the darker part of me whispered that it might not be that simple. Sometimes forging the right documents or exploiting technical loopholes can tie up the legal process for months or even years. Before bedtime, I finally allowed myself a small act of self-care. I took a hot bath in Clarissa's guest bathroom, letting the steam clear my thoughts. I realized that while I was furious and hurt, I was also determined. My name was on that deed, and no one, daughter or not, was going to displace me without a fight. As I slipped into my makeshift bed on the couch, I clutched the file close to my heart, feeling the edges of the papers press against my chest. It was a reminder that I had not lost everything. Morning came in the form of pale sunlight streaking through the window, and with it a renewed purpose. I would call the best property lawyer I could afford, maybe even someone who knew Gerald and me back in the day, someone with a personal stake in seeing justice done. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. The coffee Clarissa had made smelled enticing, but I couldn't focus on anything but the phone call I was about to make. I had no idea how Vanessa would react, but I knew that the moment I took this step, there would be no turning back. How do you feel about Evelyn finally finding the original deed? Comment 1. If you're relieved she has a fighting chance, or 2. If you're worried Vanessa has more tricks up her sleeve. I arrived at the law office with the old deed carefully tucked under my arm. The building was a modest brick structure with large windows overlooking the bustling downtown area. Inside, the air carried a sterile scent of printed pages and polished wood. After a brief wait in the reception area, where the only sound was the clicking of a secretary's keyboard, a young associate led me to an office at the end of a hallway. I had requested to meet with a senior partner named Mr. Jackson, who reportedly had decades of experience in real estate and family legal matters. Mr. Jackson, a tall man with silver hair and a reassuring smile, greeted me warmly. Mrs. Rochester, I understand you're dealing with a property dispute involving family, he said in a measured, gentle tone. Even though he was nearly a stranger, his empathetic demeanor encouraged me to spill every detail of my predicament. The changed locks, Vanessa's blatant claim of ownership, and most crucially, how I'd just rediscovered the original deed. He listened without interruption, scribbling occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he removed his reading glasses and leaned forward. The first thing to clarify, he said, tapping his pen on the desk, is whether there's been any legitimate transfer of ownership, such as a signed and notarized deed, from you to your daughter. My heart pounded as I admitted I had never signed anything of the sort. Well, that's a critical piece of information, he observed, his expression thoughtful. Your daughter would need your notarized signature to legally remove you from the title. Anything else is either incomplete or outright fraudulent. He asked to see the original deed, his eyes lighting up with professional curiosity. I watched his eyebrows lift slightly in surprise as he examined the old document. This is still valid, he concluded, handing it back to me. Unless there's another deed that supersedes this one, a legal notarized document, your name is what the county recognizes as the official owner. The relief washing over me felt like a tidal wave. Though tempered by caution, I stammered, but she must have filed something at City Hall, right? Mr. Jackson shrugged in that practical, lawyerly way. We'll find out soon enough. We can run a title search and see if any transfer was recorded, but you should be aware even if she did file something, if it wasn't properly executed with your consent, the transfer would be void. He paused, studying the anxious lines on my face. That said, people who want to commit fraud can get very creative. Let's not underestimate your daughter. She may try to drag this out or present forged signatures. Our job is to gather evidence and challenge any false documents she might produce. He then outlined the immediate steps: file a formal notice with the local authorities that my home was possibly being occupied unlawfully, initiate a cease and desist letter to Vanessa, and prepare to take the matter to civil court if she refused to relinquish possession. Every sentence he spoke was a mixture of reassurance and a forewarning of how ugly things could get. The harsh reality was that while the law might be on my side, the legal system could be slow and emotionally draining. Yet there was a subtle edge of confidence in Mr. Jackson's voice that gave me strength. He mentioned past cases in which relatives had tried to swindle elderly family members out of property. In most of those cases, he said the rightful owner prevails, especially when there's clear proof of fraudulent behavior. But he added, his gaze steady. It won't be pretty. A lump formed in my throat. I knew I was standing at the cusp of a battle I never imagined fighting, especially not against my own child. Still, I clung to the knowledge that my house was at least for now legally mine. No fancy trick could erase my signature from that original deed. As I left Mr. Jackson's office, my steps were heavier with the gravity of what lay ahead. Outside, the city's daily chaos rattled on. Cars honked, pedestrians rushed by, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a jaunty tune on a saxophone. None of it registered in my mind. I felt like I'd just walked out of a parallel universe, one where mothers fought legal battles against their own daughters, and where something as sacred as a family home could become a battleground. I paused on the sidewalk, hugging the folder, with the deed as if it were a precious treasure. A swirl of conflicting feelings rose within me: relief, anger, sorrow, and determination. The tears that stung at the corners of my eyes weren't purely of sadness. They were tears of a shattered illusion. My life had become something I barely recognized, and as I hailed a cab to head back to Clarissa's, I couldn't help but wonder what was Vanessa doing at that very moment. Was she rummaging through my pantry, laughing with friends about her new home, or simply ignoring the moral ramifications of her actions? Perhaps she thought her forgery would hold up in court, or maybe she believed I wouldn't challenge her because of our family bond. But she had misjudged me. I wasn't the timid widow she might have pegged me for. The fire in my heart had been reignited by the betrayal, and that flame was fed by the unwavering knowledge that I was in the right. Once I got back to Clarissa's, we briefly celebrated the lawyer's assessment. Then we quickly got down to business. Clarissa helped me draft an email to Mr. Jackson, listing every piece of documentation I could still find. She also urged me to be cautious in contacting Vanessa. "I know you love her," she said, "but right now she's more adversary than daughter." Hearing it phrased that way stung, yet I knew she was right. Family ties can be powerful, but they don't immunize one from the consequences of deceit, nor from the protective instincts that spark when someone tries to steal what is rightfully yours. Are you confident that the law will side with Evelyn? Or do you suspect Vanessa has hidden cards to play? Comment 1 if you trust Mr. Jackson's strategy, or 2 if you sense more trouble ahead. Time has a strange way of warping when your life is in limbo. Days stretch into what feels like weeks, and yet each moment is charged with urgency. That was my existence after meeting with Mr. Jackson. Every sunrise brought the possibility of new discoveries or new treacheries. While I waited for the official title search results, I mustered the courage to confront Vanessa, if only to glean her side of the story. I still held onto a faint, desperate hope that there was a misunderstanding or that she'd be willing to back down once she realized the legal ramifications. I called her phone numerous times, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. Text messages remained unanswered. My next move was to drive by the house. My house, to see if she was around. The sight that greeted me confirmed how profoundly she'd invaded my world. The curtains in the living room were different, replaced with trendy modern ones I'd never seen before. A fancy potted plant, also unfamiliar, sat outside on the porch. It was as though she was redecorating without a second thought. My heart sank. Peering in through a crack in the blinds, I noticed my old family photos were missing from the mantel. In their place stood decorative sculptures and abstract art pieces that screamed, "Vanessa's taste, not mine." Summoning all my courage, I knocked on the door. This time, Vanessa actually answered, though she barely opened it more than a few inches. Her face registered no guilt, only annoyance. "Why are you here?" she hissed, as though I were a door-to-door salesperson interrupting her weekend. My instinct was to barge in, but I knew better. Instead, I held up the old deed in my hand. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling with both fury and sadness. Her eyes flickered to the document, and for the briefest moment I saw a flash of uncertainty. She opened the door wider, allowing me into the foyer. I stepped inside, inhaling a painful blend of familiar scents: lemon cleaner, the faint aroma of baked bread, and the striking newness of her renovations. Our conversation escalated quickly. I demanded she explain how she planned to claim ownership without my notarized signature. She responded with a blatant confession. "You think you're the only one who can sign your name." "Mom?" My mouth fell open, horrified. She looked directly at me, a chilling calm in her eyes, and said that it hadn't been difficult to replicate my signature when she'd had piles of my paperwork at her disposal. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure she could hear it. The betrayal, already massive, now loomed even larger. The daughter I'd raised had turned to forgery against me. In a surge of composure that surprised even me, I kept my voice steady. "What you're doing is a crime, Vanessa," I said. "I've spoken to an attorney. I have proof I never signed away this property." She shrugged, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. "Go ahead," she snapped. "Take me to court, but be prepared for a fight. I've already moved in, changed the locks, and told everyone you were relocating to Florida or something. Nobody even expects you to be here." A bitter taste coated my tongue as I realized she'd laid the groundwork for this ruse long before I discovered it. I wanted to scream, to cry, to shake her until she remembered I was her mother, but I maintained my composure and simply said, "Then we'll see each other in court." Her eyes narrowed. "You never gave me what I deserved," she spat, referencing the house, as though it had been rightfully hers all along. I listened to her tirade about how I'd controlled her life, about how she felt entitled to the home that Gerald and I had worked so hard for. In that moment, I saw a side of Vanessa I didn't recognize, a deep resentment swirling beneath the surface. I left the house with tears burning my eyes, the realization settling heavily. This wasn't just a case of property theft. This was a fundamental fracture in the mother-daughter bond that might never fully mend. I drove back to Clarissa's house in a daze, replaying every vitriolic word Vanessa had hurled my way. The raw venom in her voice was unforgettable. She claimed I was overly controlling. In reality, I'd done my best to provide her opportunities I never had. It dawned on me that maybe my generous nature had inadvertently stifled her sense of independence, creating resentment. But was that truly justification for forging documents and kicking me out of my own home? That question weighed on me like a millstone around my neck. When I relayed the confrontation to Clarissa, she was aghast. "It's like she's become a stranger," she said, shaking her head. We spent the evening discussing the next steps in my legal battle. Mr. Jackson had already started drafting the lawsuit to reclaim possession of the property. He was confident, but he cautioned that Vanessa's brazen confession of forgery, although damning, might be difficult to prove without supporting evidence. We'd need handwriting experts' testimonies and a slew of legal formalities to ensure the court understood the extent of her deception. However, part of me still clung to a thread of hope that this could be resolved without a gavel hitting the bench. Could Vanessa experience a moment of clarity and realize the damage she was inflicting? Before bed, I opened a drawer in Clarissa's guest room to retrieve my nightgown and found an old photo of Vanessa and me at her high school graduation, her face radiant with pride, mine shining with maternal love. As I stared at the picture, tears slipped down my cheeks. I wondered if that Vanessa was gone forever. My gaze flicked to the image of her in a cap and gown, and I whispered, "Why, Vanessa? Why would you do this?" Deep in my heart, I acknowledged that love and heartbreak are not mutually exclusive. You can love someone and be utterly devastated by them at the same time. Whose side are you on right now? Comment 1 if you stand firmly with Evelyn, or 2 if you empathize in any way with Vanessa's motives. The day of the first court hearing arrived under an overcast sky that mirrored my mood. I showed up with Mr. Jackson by my side, clutching a folder of evidence and wearing the most formal outfit I could muster. Across the room, Vanessa sat with a smug expression, her own attorney whispering something in her ear. The entire setting felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage to reenact a personal tragedy for an audience of strangers. Yet this was the place where justice would hopefully be served. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, called the session to order. Mr. Jackson started by explaining the core of our case. Vanessa had no valid claim to the property because any alleged transfers were based on forged signatures. When the judge asked for proof, Mr. Jackson produced the original deed, emphasizing that there was no record of a legal title transfer in county files. Vanessa's attorney countered with arguments about implied gifts and how I had supposedly handed everything over to Vanessa out of free will, an allegation that made my blood boil. I'd never once stated that she could take my house as her own. Vanessa herself took the stand for a brief questioning, and her demeanor was defiant. She spouted claims about how I was emotionally manipulative and that I promised the house would be hers. At one point, she played the victim tearfully, insinuating that I was old senile and couldn't remember giving her the property. My heart pounded with indignation, the nerve of her to paint me as a confused elderly mother who'd lost her faculties. I glanced around the courtroom trying to gauge the reaction of the spectators. Some looked uneasy, others simply bored. Only the judge's expression remained impassive, which made me uneasy as well. Despite her theatrics, Mr. Jackson methodically presented the facts. No recorded sale, no notarized documents, and no eyewitness to any legitimate transfer. By the time the session ended, the judge reserved her ruling, deciding she needed more evidence and might call for forensic examination of the signatures. It was only the beginning of what promised to be a drawn-out legal battle. But I left the courthouse feeling a glimmer of hope. Public opinion soon came into play. Word spread quickly in our small community that I was in a legal dispute with my own daughter over my home. Some neighbors, those who knew me well, offered quiet support. Others kept their distance, clearly uncomfortable with the drama unfolding. A few even believed Vanessa's story that I'd gifted her the home and was now retracting it out of spite. It hurt to know that rumors were swirling, painting me as either a confused old woman or a vindictive mother refusing to let her adult daughter thrive. But my greatest solace came from unexpected places. One afternoon, an acquaintance from church dropped off a casserole and a handwritten note encouraging me to stand firm. She'd heard Vanessa's story, but felt it didn't add up given what she knew of my character. In the note, she wrote, "Justice has a way of revealing the truth, even when lies cloud our vision." I clung to those words like a life raft. The embers of my faith flickered with renewed strength. I prayed silently for wisdom, for a path that would let me protect what was mine, while also not destroying the last remnants of my relationship with Vanessa, if any still existed. Meanwhile, Mr. Jackson and his team ramped up their investigative efforts. They contacted handwriting experts to analyze my genuine signature against the ones Vanessa had submitted in her so-called legal documents. They interviewed anyone who might have seen Vanessa attempting to replicate my signature or overheard her talk about forging papers. Piece by piece, a narrative emerged of Vanessa systematically planning this for some time, carefully collecting my paperwork and forging my name on new deeds, mortgage statements, and other official forms. It was heartbreaking to see it all laid out in black and white, each piece of evidence a reminder of how cunning my daughter had become. The second hearing arrived with more tension than the first. Vanessa's attorney tried to discredit the handwriting expert we brought, questioning his credentials and implying he was biased. But Mr. Jackson countered with thorough documentation of the expert's qualifications. I sat on the edge of my seat, my nerves fraying with every passing minute. Finally, the expert took the stand and presented a detailed analysis, complete with overlays and magnified images, comparing the known examples of my signature to the allegedly forged ones. He confidently stated that the signatures on the new documents were highly likely not mine. Vanessa looked pale for the first time since this ordeal began. Yet her bravado returned quickly and her attorney pressed on with personal attacks. They tried to paint me as forgetful and manipulative, bringing up times I'd supposedly changed my mind about money or gifts I'd given Vanessa in the past. I swallowed hard, recalling how those gifts were always small amounts, like help with rent in college or paying off a credit card balance during a tough month. I never once gifted her an entire house, nor did I sign away my life's work. By the end of the second hearing, it was evident to the judge that the matter warranted a full trial. She scheduled subsequent court dates and encouraged both parties to consider mediation. The idea of sitting at a table face to face with Vanessa, discussing a settlement, made my stomach churn. This wasn't a simple dispute over borrowed money. It was my home, my sanctuary, and a tangible piece of my life with Gerald. How could we mediate something so personal, especially with the stench of betrayal so pungent in the air? As the courtroom emptied, I caught a brief glimpse of Vanessa's face, tired but still defiant. My heart twisted with a conflicting blend of pity, anger, and a faint echo of motherly love. Have you ever experienced a courtroom standoff in your own life? Or do you know someone who has? Comment 1 if this resonates with you, or 2 if this is all new territory. The trial itself unfurled like a slow-motion train wreck over several sessions. Evidence was presented, objections were raised, and each side tried to frame the narrative in a way that favored their argument. My vantage point in that courtroom allowed me to see Vanessa in a light I never thought possible. She was unyielding, almost mechanical in her insistence that I'd gifted her the house voluntarily. Sometimes I caught glimpses of doubt flashing across her eyes, but then she'd steel herself and press on. Friends and acquaintances were called to testify. My neighbor, Mrs. Klein, recalled how Vanessa moved in one day with a U-Haul truck. Mrs. Klein was under the impression that I was going on a long vacation. When asked if she ever saw me say anything about transferring ownership, Mrs. Klein shook her head vehemently. Another longtime friend of mine testified that she'd never heard me express any desire to give up the house. The facts were stacking up against Vanessa, yet she remained stone-faced. Then the moment of truth arrived. Handwriting experts took the stand once more, referencing the forged signatures in microscopic detail, down to the shaky lines and inconsistencies that screamed foul play. The weight of their testimony visibly shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom. The judge's expression grew more serious, and even Vanessa's attorney seemed to falter. By the time Mr. Jackson gave his closing argument confidently stating that no legal transfer could have occurred without my genuine notarized signature, I felt hope rise in my chest like a caged bird, finally taking flight. Vanessa's closing argument was both desperate and defiant. She tried to tug at the judge's heartstrings, painting me as someone who'd promised the house to her time and time again, only to renege at the last moment. But with each emotional claim, there was no concrete evidence, just her word against mine, and her word had already been significantly undermined by the mountain of proof that the documents she submitted were fraudulent. When the judge retreated to her chambers to deliberate, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The wait felt interminable, each minute stretched thin by anticipation. I considered all I'd been through, the shock of being locked out, the sleepless nights on Clarissa's couch, the emotional toll of seeing Vanessa turn into this stranger. My nerves were frayed to the point of breaking. Meanwhile, Vanessa sat at her table, flipping through some papers with clenched jaws, her attorney whispering furiously in her ear. After what felt like an eternity, the judge re-entered her face, calm but resolute. She began by summarizing the points of the case: the original deed in my name, the lack of any verifiable transfer, and the compelling evidence of forgery. My breath caught in my throat as she delivered her final ruling. The house legally belonged to me, and Vanessa was to vacate the premises within 30 days. She also faced possible criminal charges for forgery, pending further investigation by the district attorney's office. A hush fell over the room, followed by a palpable wave of relief on my side. Mr. Jackson placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Hey. I closed my eyes silently, thanking every force in the universe that justice had indeed prevailed, though it felt like a hollow victory. There was no celebratory smile on my face, nor any sense of triumph. How could I celebrate when the person I defeated in court was my own daughter? My eyes flickered to Vanessa. She looked stunned, her complexion ashen as though she'd finally realized the enormity of her actions. Outside the courtroom, reporters from the local news station hovered hoping for a statement. I politely declined, not wanting to turn this deeply personal matter into public spectacle any more than it already was. Vanessa brushed past me without a word, tears welling in her eyes. A small part of me wanted to reach out to hold her, to promise that we'd find a way to fix this. But something in her stiff posture warned me that any gesture of kindness would be rejected outright. In the following days, the news spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Some people offered congratulations while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. My phone rang off the hook calls from distant relatives, old friends, and even curious acquaintances, wanting to know the inside scoop. I minimized my conversations mostly because I felt drained and numb. Yes, the house was mine again, at least on paper, but my relationship with Vanessa felt irreparably damaged. The court order gave her 30 days to vacate, and I wrestled with whether I should offer her an alternative, help her find another place perhaps, or allow her to stay until she was stable. But Mr. Jackson cautioned that letting her remain could complicate the legal status and encourage more boundary violations. Besides, I wasn't sure I had the emotional capacity to share a roof with someone who had just orchestrated such a betrayal. Ultimately, I asked her to leave. I told Mr. Jackson I'd be open to discussions about transitional help if she approached me civilly, but I couldn't force the issue. A week before she was due to move out, Vanessa left a message on my voicemail, her voice laced with bitterness and pain. She claimed I was ruining her life and that she'd never forgive me. I listened to it in silence, the tears dripping onto my phone's screen. In the end, the law might protect my house, but it couldn't salvage the trust that had been shattered. Each day, the sense of relief that I was regaining my home battled with a profound grief for a bond that might never heal. Have your feelings about Vanessa changed since the start of the story? Comment 1, if you still pity her, or 2, if you think she deserved the court's ruling. When Vanessa finally vacated the premises, I half expected another altercation, but instead the day came and went with unsettling quiet. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tears or shouting. She left behind a house that felt strangely empty, even though it was the same structure I'd lived in for decades. Walking through each room, I noticed the small changes she'd made, the rearranged furniture, the new paint swatches on the walls, even a few leftover boxes filled with miscellaneous items. Some of them were personal, her high school yearbooks, photos of her with friends, old letters. I felt a pang of sadness picking up one of those pictures, a snapshot of Vanessa at age 10, grinning widely while holding a trophy from a spelling bee. Where had that bright, ambitious little girl gone? Questions about blame, regret, and heartbreak clouded my thoughts. Perhaps I had smothered her with attention, or maybe she never fully processed her father's death. Whatever the reasons, we'd now reached a point of no return in our relationship. The first thing I did was call a locksmith to change the locks yet again. This time, it wasn't an act of exclusion, but a protective measure for my own peace of mind. As the locksmith worked, I caught myself glancing down the street, half expecting Vanessa to appear, demanding another showdown. But she was gone, at least physically. Emotionally, she still occupied every corner of my thoughts. After the locks were secure, I walked around the house assessing what needed repair or replacement. I realized that in her short time here, Vanessa had definitely tried to make the space her own. Some parts of the home felt like they belonged to a stranger. Deep cracks in the wall glared at me, symbolic of the chasm between us. I told myself I'd fix them in time, patching and painting maybe one room at a time. A small part of me hoped that healing my home would also help heal the wound in my heart. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The air in the house felt heavy, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge a truth I'd been avoiding. My fingers trembled as I pulled out a sheet of stationery and began writing a letter to Vanessa. I wasn't sure if I'd ever send it or if it was just for my own sanity, but the words poured out in an unfiltered stream of emotion. Vanessa, I'm sorry we ended up here. I never wanted any of it. I'm hurt and I'm angry, but I still love you. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, and maybe we shouldn't. But I do hope someday you'll find your way back to me, not as a thief, but as my daughter. I wrote pages of reflections, apologies, and even confessions of my own shortcomings as a parent. I acknowledged that somewhere along the line, we'd stopped communicating honestly. Perhaps if I'd noticed her resentment sooner, I could have prevented this. But regrets are a poor remedy for present heartbreak. When I finished the letter stretched on for several handwritten pages, my pen ink smudged in places from errant tears, I folded it neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it in a drawer. Maybe one day I'd give it to her if the opportunity for genuine reconciliation ever presented itself. That night, the house felt both comforting and lonely. It was comforting because it was mine again, every wall and corridor, a testament to the life Gerald and I had built lonely, because a home is not just a structure, but the people who fill it with life and laughter. And now that life and laughter had been tarnished by betrayal, days turned into weeks, and I settled back into my routines. I swept the floors, did some light repainting, and carefully unpacked the boxes Vanessa had left behind. Some I set aside for her to pick up if she ever chose to. I decided that though she had wronged me, I couldn't simply discard her memories. Despite everything, she was still my daughter, flesh of my flesh. Friends and neighbors who heard about my legal victory often asked how I felt now that I'd reclaimed my house. My answer was never simple. It's bittersweet, I'd say, forcing a small smile. Yes, I was relieved to have my home back, but the battle came at a steep price. When I looked around the freshly painted living room and the sunlit kitchen, I sensed a lingering emptiness where my daughter's presence should have been. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. My heart fluttered, thinking it might be Vanessa, but it was only the mail carrier with a stack of letters. Amid the bills and advertisements was a handwritten note from an address I didn't recognize. Inside, I found a brief message. I apologize if I went too far. I just wanted what I thought was mine. The signature, Vanessa. It was the vaguest semblance of an apology, but it was something a small crack in the armor she'd built around herself. I breathed a sigh of cautious relief. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing, though. I suspected it would be a long and winding road. For now, I placed her note with the letter I'd written. Two words came to mind. Baby steps, because that's often how the biggest journeys start. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, feeling a soft breeze drift through. My gaze swept over the yard, the garden that still carried faint traces of Gerald's handiwork. My lips curved into a tentative smile. Though scarred and shaken, I was still standing, and the house, my house, was still mine. In that quiet moment, I finally allowed myself to hope that the worst was behind me, and that the future, uncertain as it was, might hold room for both healing and peace. Thank you for reading this story to the end. Do you believe Evelyn and Vanessa can ever mend their relationship? Comment 1 if you think reconciliation is possible, or 2 if the damage is beyond repair. Thank you for joining me tonight on her Fireside Stories channel. I hope Evelyn's emotional journey left you with plenty to reflect on. While the battle for her home was won, the deeper wounds left behind by betrayal might take years or even a lifetime to heal. Do you think Evelyn and Vanessa can ever mend their fractured relationship? Or is some damage permanent? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if you've ever faced a similar dilemma or witnessed something like this in your life. Also, please share where you listened from. I always enjoy knowing where my wonderful audience is joining from. If you enjoyed tonight's story, consider subscribing and turning on notifications to support the channel and never miss another emotional tale. Until next time, keep your hearts warm and your stories close. Good night.